So in this video we combine exercise 1 and 2. So what we want to do here is that we want to show the effects of the policy on output in period t+1. So right now the economy is operating at the zero lower bound for the nominal policy rate. This we have written here. So the nominal interest rate is equal to 0. There is a large government deficit and the economy is operating at potential. That means that the output level is equal to yn, that is the natural level of output. So what is going on is that there is a newly elected government and they choose to cut spending and thereby reducing the deficit in period t+1, t+2 and the subsequent periods. So in question 1 and 2, we would like to show the effect of the policy on output in period t+1 and the effect of the policy on the inflation in period t+1. Therefore, we write up the ISLM-PC model. What is going on is that the government decides to cut G. What happens when the government decreases government spending? Well, when government decreases government spending, aggregate demand decreases. So the total demand for goods and services decrease, and we know that total output is decomposed of private consumption, investments, and government spending. And if government spending decreases, then also output will decrease due to the fact that the government is spending less resources on government goods. And this will, of course, decrease output. The interest rate remains the same. So for the interest rate, let's assume it is equal to R prime. If the government today decrease government spending, then for any real policy rate, the output level will decrease. Lower government spending is associated with lower aggregate demand. A lower aggregate demand will shift the IS curve to the left. The real policy rate stays the same. So this must constitute to a lower output level. So we go from point A to point B, which is the new short-run equilibrium here. Okay? Short-run equilibrium. Intuitively, it makes good sense. The real policy rate stays the same. Government cuts spending. As a result, the government deficit will decrease in period t+1 because government spending decreases. But also aggregate demand will decrease. And when the aggregate demand decreases, total demand for goods and services will be lower. And as a result, the firms of the economy will simply produce a lower output level. So output will decrease. As a result, the difference between, the inflation rate in period t+1 will be lower than the expected inflation rate. We see here on the PC curve that the difference between actual inflation and expected inflation is negative. Okay, it's less than 0, meaning that the inflation rate is lower than the expected inflation rate. And the reason is now the government is not spending as many resources on government goods as they did before. As a result, there will not be the same high pressure on the demand side in the economy as we always have had. Therefore, the general pressure on the price level will be lower, and the actual inflation rate, the realized inflation rate, will be lower than what was expected. So until now, the expected rate of inflation has been positive. So what does this imply for the real policy rate? Well, in order to calculate the real policy rate, we have to recall the Fisher equation, which says that the real policy rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus expected rate of inflation. Since the economy is operating at the zero lower bound, we know that the nominal interest rate is equal to zero. Therefore, the real interest rate must be equal to minus the expected rate of inflation. So here we have a minus sign. This is negative. And we have the expected rate of inflation, which is positive. So this has been like this up until now. As a result, we have that the real interest rate so far has been negative. Since the inflation persistently has been lower than the target rate of inflation, expected inflation suddenly changes. The agents of the economy reform, they adapt to this persistently lower inflation by lowering their expectations. So what is happening now in exercise 3 is that the expected inflation changes to a negative value. So how does this affect the output? So until now, we've had the expected rate of inflation has been positive. Now we have that the expected rate of inflation is negative. So in order to assess the effect on the output level, we need to investigate how the real interest rate is affected of this change. How do we calculate the real interest rate? Well, recall the Fisher equation that says that the real policy rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the expected rate of inflation. Still, the economy is operating at the zero lower bound, so the nominal interest rate is equal to zero. So the real policy rate is equal to minus the expected inflation. Since the expected inflation is negative now, we have a minus sign here times something. That something is the expected rate of inflation, which now is negative. So we have minus times a minus. That becomes positive, so greater than zero. So as the expected inflation changes to a negative value, we have that the real policy rate goes from being less than zero to now being greater than zero. How does this affect the real policy rate? Well, it goes up. We just said that. So initially we have the real policy rate. Let's call it R prime. We have it here on the y-axis. Now, when the expected inflation changes to a negative value, we get this new real policy rate that is R double prime. And it changes. It increases. It goes from being negative to being positive. So the LM curve shifts up. So as the agents readapt to their expectations about the rate of inflation, the real policy rate increases. And what happens when the real policy rate increases? Well, when the real policy rate increases, we know that the cost of borrowing increases. As the cost of borrowing increases, we know that agents of the economy will invest in fewer investment goods. Okay, so total investments will decrease. As a result, aggregate demand will decrease, and this will lower the output level. So we go from y prime to y double prime. So whenever the real policy rate increases, we know that the cost of borrowing increases. This discourages investments because the cost of borrowing is now much, much higher. So what is going on is that the output is affected negatively. So the next question now is how does the zero lower bound on the nominal interest rate make a fiscal consolidation more difficult? So fiscal consolidation, so what does it mean? So we have to define fiscal consolidation. What does it mean? Well, it means that we have a government that aims at reducing the deficit while enhancing the GDP. So fiscal consolidation means that we have a government that aims at decreasing the government deficit. And so far, we have had a government who was aimed at decreasing the deficit. In the exercise, how did we see this come about? Well, the government has been decreasing government spending in each and every period from period T plus 1, T plus 2, and in the subsequent periods. How could we bring about an increase in output while lowering the deficit? We know that the effect of lowering the deficit through a decrease in government spending affects the output negatively. The only way that we can bring about an increase in government spending is by decreasing the real policy rate. So what the central bank could do in order to enhance GDP, in order to bring about an increase in output, to offset the negative effect of a decrease in government spending. Remember, a decrease in government spending here is necessary in order to bring about a decrease in the deficit. In order to counteract the effect of a decrease in output, the central bank could lower its policy rate. But the problem here is that the economy is already operating at the zero lower bound, and it would be impossible for the central bank to bring about a decrease in the real policy rate because the nominal interest rate has already reached its lower bound. So the central bank here cannot set a lower interest rate. It cannot set a nominal interest rate that is below zero. So therefore, fiscal consolidation, that is enhancing both the deficit and output, becomes very difficult by a combination of both fiscal policy and monetary policy. So monetary policy is completely excluded from enhancing the GDP by controlling the nominal interest rate alone. So the only way that the central bank could bring about an increase in GDP or output would be through quantitative easing or forward guidance or other ways of manipulating with the real policy rate. So in this case here, central bank cannot lower the nominal interest rate. It's already equal to zero. Since they can't lower the nominal interest rate anymore, they cannot affect the real policy rate and thereby enhancing investments in the overall economy. So, in other words, the central bank cannot offset the recessionary effects of the contractionary fiscal policy and cannot thereby bring output back to the natural level. The only way of bringing output back again would then be to introduce some fiscal policy to increase G, but this would not make the deficit any better. So the deflational spiral will probably continue, unless the government stops focusing on the deficit and starts increasing government spending in order to generate some economic activity in order to bring about an increase in output. Otherwise, if the government in all periods keeps cutting government spending, aggregate demand will keep decreasing, and we will see a continuously decrease in the expected rate of inflation and thereby an increase in the real policy rate. So here we could think of one thing. So in order to limit the negative effect of the contractionary fiscal policy, so the main take home, in order to limit the negative effect of the contractionary fiscal policy, the central bank could bring about a decrease in the nominal interest rate in order to bring about a decrease in the real policy rate and thereby increasing investments. But this is not possible since the economy is already operating at the zero lower bound. Therefore, this deflationary spiral will keep continuing unless the central bank, the government, introduces, unless the government brings about an increase in government spending in order to increase the economic activity.